On this gloomy first Sunday of a new year, a day that was preceded by several gloomy days and will likely be followed by additional gloomy days, the prophet Isaiah comes to us saying, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you." Now, perhaps more than a few of you this morning are fighting back the urge to say, "Put a sock in it, Isaiah." After all, where exactly is that light? As we look around, what we see is the current gloom of cloudy, rainy, cold days, compounded by the gloomy darkness of winter's long nights, and compounded even more so by the darkness of a huge pandemic cloud that has resulted in loss of jobs and hunger, homelessness, and hundreds of thousands of deaths. Get real, Isaiah. Look around. We have good reason these days not to be in the mood to rise and shine. If the glory of the Lord has risen upon us, then shouldn't it be easier for us to see it? I have a feeling that the people of Isaiah's day were actually thinking just about the same thing when Isaiah first instructed them to arise and shine. That year was about 537 BC, and the exiled Babylonian Jews were returning home. King Cyrus of Persia had conquered Babylon about 2 years earlier, and he was allowing them to go back home to Judah. Many of them had been born in Babylon during the 70-year period of exile, so they had never personally seen their homeland or the great city of Jerusalem. But for years, those exiles had heard story after story told by their parents and their grandparents, stories about the peace and prosperity of Judah, stories about the beauty of the land and the magnificence of Jerusalem's temple. Those exiles returned home with such high expectations, but what they discovered upon their return was ruin, decay, and corruption. Those exiles returned with excitement and hope for what awaited them, only to have their lifelong hopes crushed by the discouraging state of reality. When the country's leaders in government and business, as well as educators, skilled artisans, and spiritual leaders, were all forced to relocate to Babylon about 70 years earlier, those left behind did not have the skills, the training, or the resources required to run the government, to educate the young, to see to the spiritual health of the community that was left behind. So instead of health and glory and wealth, they found a mess in Jerusalem. The destroyed temple had not been rebuilt. Buildings were crumbling all over the city. Incompetent and corrupt authorities were in charge. And there was a terrible apathy in the nation's faith. In their religious practice, faith seemed to be in short supply in Judah. The exiled returnees were devastated, and their hopes were crushed. It was at that time of huge disappointment and heightened despair that Isaiah spoke, inviting them to embrace a very different reality than what their eyes were actually seeing. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord will arise upon you, and the glory will appear over you, says Isaiah. Those children, those young men and women who were torn away from their families, from their home as spoils of war, have returned home, and they are unharmed. They're safe. And Isaiah tells them that joy and prosperity are close at hand. In fact, this future vision will be even bigger and more joyous than what they are currently able to see and even imagine, because the homecoming will extend beyond Judah as all people are drawn by the light of God. Nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn, says Isaiah. So lift up your eyes and look around. They all gather together. They come to you. Isaiah describes to the exiles how others will see the light and come to the nation of Israel in a unified act of tribute to God. They will come not because the nation is large, threatening, powerful, and wealthy, but because it is clear to everyone that Israel is a people of God. Instead of being under the control of foreign rule, the nation is clearly in the care of God, and this reality will be both visible and it will be inspiring to everyone. People both near and far will recognize God's presence and will be drawn to the emanating light of God. By way of these prophetic words, the prophet Isaiah asked a discouraged and despairing people to stand tall and to confront their darkness and to then shine with a light that has its origin in the glory of the Lord. Why? Because in the days and years ahead, the light of God's glory can and will overcome the darkness, and as it does, more and more people will notice, and more people will be drawn to it. In my Christmas Eve incarnation message, my focus was that of Jesus as the light of the world. I clarified for you in that message the Bible's basic understanding of darkness and how that word either reflects the presence of evil and the often awful reality of sin, or it reflects the struggles, heartache, and despair that is experienced in this life. Whether the presence of evil or the experience of despair, darkness has the power to shut out hope and joy from our lives. But Isaiah's good news for the returned exiles of Judah is that God's glory can and in fact will shine upon the dark places, places that appear to be forsaken by God. In fact, God's glory will shine so brightly that Judah will once again be a place of noticeable joy, a place of great hope. On this gloomy first Sunday of a new year, following our yearly celebration of welcoming the true light which enlightens everyone, we are challenged to consider the relevancy of Isaiah's prophecy for us and for our day. What does it look like and feel like to rise and shine amidst the reality of our current darkness? What does it mean that God's light appeared to us by way of a flesh and blood baby 2,000 years ago? And then that embodied light grew up, teaching us and showing us by his example what it really looks like when the glory of God shines and God's kingdom is revealed. We know that embodied light suffered and died and was buried in a tomb, and yet the light remained with us, continued to shine among us. This is the light that pierces the deepest of darkness, a light that darkness will never be able to extinguish. The presence of God's light in the world is an invitational challenge for all people of faith to arise and shine. This faithful response of shining in the midst of all evidence to the contrary is proof proof that the glory of the Lord has risen upon us. Whatever unfolds as a result of the light of God's glory, we are told that the rising and shining of God's people will attract attention. Isaiah's image of light leading to the gathering of treasures from all the nations as an offering to God takes us once again to the birth of Jesus and to the wise men from the east, from the far east, offering their treasures they have brought to the one sent by God to redeem not only Israel, but all of creation. For he's the one whose arms opened wide on the cross to draw all people to himself. So as we wait for the next revelation, perhaps the final revelation, we dare to rise and shine with the light and live into the promise. Because we have seen the glory of the Lord rising upon us, our response is to offer our finest gifts, ourselves, and to bring others along with us until all are gathered to him in the light of his glory. This shining light of God's people, this sharing of hope and making a difference in every age is possible only as God's people reflect the one who is the true light of God's glory. This time of the year, we just naturally live amidst a lot of physical darkness. During these dark days, and especially at those times when snow covers the ground, I am reminded of the importance of reflectors positioned along the side of my driveway. Now, those of you who have been to the church parsonage, you know that the driveway is curved. Those reflectors not only help us to maneuver correctly when there is a blanket of snow covering the driveway, they are absolutely essential for the snowplow. Those reflectors have no source of light in and of themselves. They simply reflect the light that is directed at them. Similarly, God's people do not generate light, but by the grace of God, we can be effective reflectors of God's light. Of course, we need to lift up our eyes and look around. The glory of the Lord is present, but we have to be looking up and around if we are going to be aware and see that light. In the midst of the dark realities of life, we can easily fail to see the light. Sometimes it's the busyness and the distractions of the holiday season that are very distracting. And when we arrive at this time following the celebration of Jesus' birth, we realize our failure to both see and reflect the light of the world. At other times, and this time of pandemic darkness is likely one of those other times, you may find it difficult to lift your eyes and see beyond your isolated existence to the glory of the Lord revealed in Jesus. Isaiah's proclamation to the returned exiles and to all of us who find ourselves living in dark and despairing days is a word of hope. And it is a word of challenge. To live as reflectors of God's light amidst the gloom and darkness of our current days is to insert the clarity of faith and the power of hope for the purpose of bringing about a future that is markedly different and better than the present. Sometimes this reflecting of God's light is going to stir up controversy because light has a way of calling attention to things others may not really want to see, like those who are hungry and sick, poor and oppressed, homeless and imprisoned, neglected and abused, helpless and hopeless, people who when we take time to look closely, actually reflect the very presence of Jesus. Truly, I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me, said Jesus. Being a light reflector when surrounded by darkness is not easy. But the world in Isaiah's time, as well as our time, is sure in need of light. In every age, people of faith and hope who are willing to look up and around while standing together are desperately needed. As we enter 2021, we do so during a time of separation, a time when standing 6 feet apart is the norm. So most days it can feel a lot like we are standing alone. But we are not. I remind you today that we are not. The light of the glory of God has arisen, and we have seen the glory of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John the Baptist testified to that light. And every time people of faith dare to shine and be the light of Christ in the midst of darkness, we also testify to that light. So here, at the beginning of a new year, let us enter into a time of Holy Communion with the one who is God's true light, who is our salvation, the world's salvation. The Lord Jesus invites all who seek to know and follow him, all who seek to reflect the light in this world, to be fed and to be enlightened by his presence now as we come together. So let us prepare ourselves for that holy encounter as we open our hearts, as we now enter into a time of confession.